Ruby Community Conference organized by Visuality presents Marco Roth, Herb and ReActionView. Enjoy.
Thank you, Adrian. Yeah, my name is Marco, and today I want to talk about some of the stuff I've been working on over the last year now, which is like Herb and ReActionView, and I want to kind of show you how this new technology can be the foundational kind of piece that we can use for the view layer, maybe going forward. Yeah, if you haven't met, please come say hi after the talk. And the one thing that I really do is I do love open source. As Adrian mentioned, there's so many projects I got lucky to be able to work on, and there's so many cool things that I was lucky to have worked on. And I love Ruby. I love Ruby because it's elegant, because it's expressive, because it's a joy to write. And that's also kind of the motivation why I want to keep writing these libraries and tools, because I want to keep it as attractive as possible for people to come into the community and enjoy Ruby like all of you are doing already. And we also want to keep it as productive as possible, so we get to do the most out of our time with working with these tools. And the other thing is that I have been heavily involved with and around Hotwire. I have been, as Adrian mentioned, maintaining Stimulus Reflex and Cable Ready, but also on and off maintaining Stimulus. And one thing I have been focusing on after that was more the developer tooling side of things. A few years ago, I was able to extract some of this logic into Stimulus LSP. It's a language server that helps you write better Stimulus codes. After that, we kind of did something similar with Turbo LSP, which is not as doing as much as Stimulus LSP does, but it's still kind of helpful in a way. And that kind of work, these two LSPs that I worked before, kind of led into this whole Herb ecosystem thing that I want to talk about today. And then later, this is also what got into ReActionView, which we'll also come back later to. One thing that kind of most people are allergic to in this room are these kind of logos here. But the thing is, they really have awesome tooling. And if you are using TypeScript or React or all of these components, this tooling just works. You kind of create a file, you don't have to install anything, it just works, and then you have great feedback from these tools. Another kind of nice ecosystem is like the Vite and Vue ecosystem. They have pretty much figured it out from the framework that's for writing views up until to VitePress for writing documentation that looks just beautiful and works really nicely. So they have a really good tool chain from front to back. And with Ruby, we don't really have that, and that's why I want to improve that. So I have been teaching at bootcamps with LeWagon, and I have been mentoring some early career engineers, but also have been helping businesses adopting Hotwire. And they have been complaining about that you don't have any feedback if stuff is not working, you get no error messages, you get no log, you get no kind of feedback. And it's the most common source of frustration for most people. But also, it's not just about the tooling itself, that you don't get feedback, but also because you have so many choices and decisions to make when you want to kind of work with these frameworks. We know that Rails is famously omakase, which means it has some opinions, but also you can swap it out if you don't kind of want it. So it kind of limits the decisions you have to make. And usually the Rails defaults are awesome and bring you very far, which is also what makes it so productive in the end. But at the same time, our industry doesn't stand still, as you can see with AI now even. But even in the last 10 years, there's been so much progress in the web and JavaScript platforms that we cannot just ignore that. And the thing is that these expectations from people and also from other engineers are that we have more advanced tools that we want to use. And the platform really improved over the last 10 years. So with HTML and CSS, you got so many new features, including like web components and PWAs, but also the import maps that we have been seeing recently in Rails as well. With CSS, we got container queries, we got also functions, and even custom properties now that we can use and kind of improve our CSS. Also, nesting is kind of big. That was the big thing about Sass back in the day, but now we just have this natively in CSS. There are also a lot of new web APIs that you can use to make stuff even more efficient that are just built into the browser now. And With all that the platform gives us now, and what we have in our view layer in Rails, there are quite a few other problems that we can have. How do you encapsulate views? How do you test views? How do you make them more performant? It's all there are some solutions to all of these things, but none of them really are built into Rails with a good default. And here's just a list of tools that come and gone over the years with what you can have to make decisions about when you want to write some front-end code in your Rails app. This is just what the bundling and side of things is, but then there's also frameworks built on top of it that want to solve more problems, and there's so many tools that it's really hard to know what you need. And I've been wondering how we can approach this problem and solve it, and with the way of making it as backwards compatible as possible. Because most of these other tools, they have some good ideas, but they are so different from what you are used to in regular Rails work that they're not compatible. And they also don't really feel familiar with what ReActionView has been for the last 20 years now. So we want to write more ambitious full-stack Rails applications that have JavaScript logic, that have front-end stuff built in, and that's what we want to focus on. So today, I want to give a background of what we can expect from these tools going forward. So I want to show you how Herb came to be, how Herb can help you today, and also what's next with Herb in general. So Herb came to be because, as I mentioned earlier, of Stimulus LSP. This was a few years ago. And one of the most common things that you when you start with Stimulus is you have to create a controller, a Stimulus controller. And you have this file name, you have to give the name, it lives in your app JavaScript folder. And in this case, it's just a simple controller. It has a console log in the connect action, which should log this when this controller connects to the DOM. And then you go back to your HTML, you write data controller attributes to connect this controller to your elements, and you reference this controller that you just wrote, and then you check your console in the browser and it doesn't log anything. Even though this has clearly a console log action here in the connect method. The problem here is that this is using an underscore instead of a dash here. And that's something that's very common that we can fix and have tooling for, but nothing told me that I did something wrong and something was wrong about my code I wrote. And these mistakes happen so easily, and it's so easy to introduce bugs like that and have no feedback and no assurance that the code I wrote is actually fine and valid. So a few years ago at Rails World, we launched this and a few other initiatives to improve these tools, and that's what's available today. So you can install the Stimulus LSP plugin. It gives you autocomplete with all the possible values that you can use in the attributes, including the data action. It will tell you with a diagnostic in your editor that something is wrong about this. And this is all helpful, but the problem is with Rails that we have ERB as well. So this today only works in HTML. We had no ERB support. And in HTML, this is beautiful and simple. That's what it looks like in HTML. But oftentimes, our ERB views look like this. And then there's still, again, no feedback and no tooling support. So we have been missing the support for these HTML ERB-specific or Rails-specific helpers that we need to understand. And especially with Turbo LSP, because with Turbo and Turbo Rails, most of the things are actually in ERB helpers. You need to have an understanding of how this is, of how this works, for us to be able to give you diagnostics. Then also, the Ruby LSP itself was missing ERB support a few years ago. And at RubyConf a few years ago as well, we tried to make this work, tried to hack on the hack day to see if we can add ERB support to Ruby LSP. And we couldn't really figure it out. We couldn't really make it work because we didn't have a proper way to parse ERB files. And that was my motivation, because I had these three tooling that needed more information about our views. And just after a few failed attempts to make it work in a hacky way, I decided I want to tackle the bigger picture, which is to write a proper HTML ERB parser that can understand both the HTML and the ERB at the same time. You can also call this like a HTML-aware ERB parser, because it's mostly an ERB parser that also understands HTML. But what this gives us is it gives us a structural awareness of how and where our ERB tags are being used in context of our HTML elements. So almost a year ago now, I got accepted to give a talk at Ruby Kaigi, and I wanted to kind of present this work with the parser there. And that's where I launched this parser, and this was released in April last year. And what it kind of gave us is a parser. It's written in C, because it should be kind of available on all platforms. So we want to use it from Ruby, we want to be able to use it from JavaScript, we want to be able to use it from pretty much anywhere, because we want just to have a portable parser. And then I realized that we can also build more tools on top of that, including like a formatter and a linter and more advanced tools. And then at Rails World, I had another talk last year where I then launched the linter, the formatter, the language server, and while working on those, I realized, well, we might need a few more kind of building blocks to make this all work. So now it turned into this whole ecosystem of tools to make it really like a full tool chain for HTML ERB files. So yeah, we have already a rich ecosystem today, and there's a lot more we can do now that we have the foundational work done. So how can help you today? The idea is there should be no setup, there should be no config or low config, and you can just run this on your project. Even if you have nothing installed today, it should just work without having installed anything additional. So where can you start? If you have an app with HTML ERB, or use ERB for your use in a other Ruby framework, you can use the Herb language server. It's available pretty much on all major editors. There's a plugin for it in the VS Code store, but also if you use NeoVim or even Set, it's built in right away today. You can just install this, and then you have immediate feedback in your views. Yeah, as I told you, for Set, it's already built in. For NeoVim, there is like a simple config you can enable. It's part of the LSP config package, so you can just, in your Vim config, enable the Herb language server, and it just works. And what this gives you, it gives you pretty much HTML diagnostics for saying you're missing tags, but also if you have invalid syntax, it tells you that something is wrong about your syntax. So most of that is not really something that you couldn't get from an HTML-like service too, but it gets more tricky if you have like Ruby then that you want to also have diagnostics for. In this case, we have this if, but it has no end, so it will tell you that there's a missing end in this template too. And the cool thing is, because it's like so efficient, so fast, and part of the whole integrated VS Codes, it's like, your editor, it's just instant. You type it, and it will just give you instant feedback. Then for the linter, we wanted to have a similar kind of thing that we have with the Ruby style guide. The Ruby style guide is kind of enforced with Rubocop, that you have a way of writing Ruby files. So we want to have a tool that can give you some guidance of how you write good views. And now we can also kind of guide people towards best practices, because we have a linter. We can tell people we see a pattern here that doesn't really make sense, or it could be written more efficiently, so we can tell you that. Yeah, you can avoid common mistakes. You can enforce even some accessibility kind of constraints. And the thing here as well is it's part of the language server. It just works as part of your editor. You just enable it, install it, and then it's enabled by default. And you can enable this or disable these rules if you don't like them. But it now allows for really kind of advanced diagnostics too. In this case, we have duplicate IDs in the same documents, and it will tell you that something is duplicate because it understands the ERB flow and the Ruby flow, the control flow of how these things are rendered. There's also simple things like styles, style rules, and so on. The cool thing is all of these have a link. You can click on them. It brings you to the documentation and some explanation of why these rules exist and what it tries to enforce. And we also obviously have some examples of good codes and some examples of bad codes. And this is part of the docs. And we run the linter itself on the docs too. So you can see the code examples. You see the annotated kind of diagnostics right in your browser. So today we have 70 linter rules that you can enable. Most of them are enabled by default, and there are a lot of ideas for other rules. And if you have any rules that you think might make sense, then please open an issue and take a look. The other thing is we want to have a formatter for auto-formatting HTML ERB. So the idea is we give the format kind of this blob of templates. You save your file in your editor or you run the CLI, and then it just outputs you a beautifully formatted document that's consistent. It's always the same kind of style, and it just works. If you have the language server, you can also enable the formatter, and it will do that as you go. You can write and mess up your file, save it again, and then it will kind of just snap right back. These are just available as NPX or as NPM packages for the reason being that you can just run them without installing anything. So if you have nodes, you have NPX, and then you can just run them without anything else. We also have a CLI, as I just showed you. It will also show you in the CLI beautifully formatted codes and where stuff is wrong, and kind of you can see easily what's wrong about it. And in GitHub Actions, you can add these 4 lines. That's all you need. You don't need to set up anything, don't need to install anything. NPX is pre-installed, and then it just works. So this runs in most apps in less than 2 seconds. And now, today, I have a new release, actually. I released Herb 09 today. There's a lot of stuff in there. It's probably the biggest release so far. And what we have new is a lot of new linter rules, 24 in total. I want to highlight one specifically here. In this case, we have 2 diffs that have the same structure. And we see that this is in a control flow in an if condition. And the linter now understands that you are using the same markup in both cases, so you can kind of reformat the document and kind of pull out this diff into the outer container to kind of clean up your views, which is really cool. The other thing is document highlights. It's part of the language server protocol. What it allows you is if you put your cursor on one of the tags, it will highlight the kind of matching closing tag, which really helps of navigating large view files. The other kind of big thing that we have been working on for a long time now, but finally we're able to pull it off, is to expose the Prism nodes in. So we are using Prism, which is the Ruby parser that Ruby itself uses to kind of run your code. And Prism is also written in C, so we can use Prism in our Herb parser. But we weren't really able to expose these nodes back to the user. So what we can do today now is if you parse this document up there, like this simple link to, which is like a Ruby code because it's in this ERB tag, we have this parse result from the parser. And what we get back now here is this Prism node, which represents the exact syntax tree that Prism returned for us. So we can have both the HTML and the Ruby code in all the nodes, which allows us to do more advanced analysis now. And this enables us now to also bring, actually, finally, the support for ReActionView helpers. So I'll show you earlier this example here, which is pure HTML. And then you have this other example, which is pure ERB style. And what we have now is we have in your language server, we can kind of have this code block. And if you hover over it, it will give you kind of the equivalent HTML that would be the case as if it would be written like that. So you can see the language server understands what these evaluate to in the end in HTML and can give you a representation of that. And this works for all the common helpers you have. You can see here also, if you have still dynamic Ruby, it will still show you kind of a interpolated version of that in the hover. And this is for a few tags that we support now, but you want to support the full range of things, so we have to ship a few more, but this is kind of the foundational piece that we need now. The other thing is, because we have this understanding now, all our linter rules that previously just worked on HTML now automatically also work on, in this case, this link to works on the Ruby version of that. So we have written our linter rules to operate on HTML elements, but because we have the translation layer now, all these rules automatically work on the ERB tags as well, which is kind of cool. And now if you have written some of these tags and you don't like them or you liked it the other way and kind of want to swap between them, we have new rewrite actions. So you can kind of hover over them, click rewrite, and it will kind of convert back and forth between the two syntaxes, and it understands that in kind of full detail, which is kind of nice. The other thing we have now are folding ranges, which are also now based on the syntax tree, so it understands where stuff starts and where it stops, and gives you this more intelligent kind of folding of where you can collapse these blocks. And the final last thing here is that we have now smart toggling for ERB comments. If you have been commenting in any ERB file before, you might have screwed up your file. But this should finally, I think, now solve it, that it understands what you are selecting currently, or trying to comment out, and then comment out it's based on how you selected it and what's actually in it. So it now fully understands what you are trying to comment out and can do it in the right way. So yeah, this is all Herb 09. There's a lot of stuff, more stuff in here, but I mentioned the most important things. The other nice thing is that we have now a lot of optimizations in here, which makes the whole parser, which was already super fast, 20% faster in some benchmarks. So it's really kind of cool to see, even though it's basically fast already, to make it even faster. I have a blog post coming up too on the Herb blog, and you can kind of see all the details there. But yeah, so far, this has all been about tooling and about improving your developer experience. But working on this tool made me realize also that if we have all this knowledge now and all this understanding of how these things translate back and forth, that we can also try to render this as actually, we can try to evaluate these templates ourselves. So at Rails World last year, I gave a talk on the Herb engine specifically, which is now a replacement for eRuby, which is what Rails uses today. And what this is now is it's a HTML-aware ERB rendering engine. It is trying to be compatible with eRuby 100%, so you can just kind of drop it in. And as long as you have valid HTML, it will also work with Herb. Otherwise, it will tell you that you have invalid HTML. So it's using the Herb parser to kind of parse the documents and then try to compile this so we can actually execute and run it and render the HTML. But yeah, since we kind of already know that stuff is wrong in your template and where it's wrong and can kind of pinpoint this already in your editor, we can also bring this now to the errors pages that Rails has. So if you have a syntax error today, it will show you this kind of blob of saying, somewhere in this template here, there's an error. Go figure it out. And obviously, there was a missing closing tag here, as you can clearly see. No. But now the parser exactly knows where stuff is wrong, so it can pinpoint it to you and tell you that it is wrong. We also, do this in the editor already, so you can see where stuff is happening. But now you can also see this in the browser, and it will tell you exactly where this is broken. But yeah, since we control the whole rendering and the whole flow of parsing and evaluating, we can also do more advanced things now because we have the full understanding of these structures. So what we can do is we can inject additional HTML attributes in development to annotate these elements. So what we can do is we add these data Herb attributes, these data attributes, which are not really visible to the user if you look at the page, but we can annotate these things in the code. And with some CSS now, we can make it so that you see the outlines of your views and your partials visually when you look at the page. We can add some more attributes to kind of have a type attached to it. And based on the type, we can then make it so it has different colors. So in this case, we use the blue color for views, the partials are green, and the components are this yellow-orange color. So you can also see where stuff is coming from, where it's being rendered from. And then finally, we can also have a relative path in your project. So when you hover over these labels, it will show you the full path of where this is coming from. And then finally, when we add the full path, like on your system, we can make it so when you click these labels, that it will open it right in your editor where this is defined. And this is kind of really magical because it just gives this full loop of how, like you look at the page, you know something is wrong about it, but you don't know where this is being rendered from. But clicking on the label, it will bring you right back into the editor where this is actually coming from, which is super handy. We also give you this kind of neat toggling menu at the top right. In this case, we can also show you the ERB output tag. So if we toggle this, we see the purple outlines, which are where you're using dynamic Ruby, where you interpolate values. So you can see which parts are actually dynamic. And we can also make it so when you hover over them with this additional toggle, that you can see what was used in the templates to render this exact thing in the browser. Now, we can also click on these exact labels, and then it will also bring you to the right line and the right column in your editor of where this was exactly used. And this gives us really valuable feedback for the kind of life cycle of working with these views. But the other kind of nice thing is because we are using the same parser now for running your dev tools, and we are using the same parser for rendering your views, there's no mismatch anymore between what's being used in your editor and what's being used for the engine, which makes it a lot more accurate and more kind of true to what we are actually doing in production. So we kind of took this engine from a string template engine and made it HTML aware and made it so it's fully aware of all its elements and stuff like that. And because we have all this understanding and are aware of that, we can enhance it and kind of make it even better for you to kind of look and debug. This was kind of part of the Rails World talk last year, and it included some more kind of nice details there, but that's kind of the idea. But now we kind of have the tooling and the rendering figured out, so what can we do next? The kind of big problem here is, I guess, is still ReActionView. ReActionView is really kind of, in a way, old and dated, and it hasn't gotten much love in recent years from the Rails community in general. So I kind of want to see if we can kind of try to reimagine how ReActionView works, maybe try to re-engineer some of the parts, and also see if we can make it reactive, as you might kind of know it from React and other frameworks. And that's kind of this idea of ReActionView, this kind of ecosystem of tools, to kind of explore what we can do to make this nicer to work with. And I presented a few things here, which are the 6 adoption levels of how this could look like. What we have with Herb and the engine today are the first 2 levels, to have the better error messages and the engine now. And we can now look into more things. So ReActionView takes the Herb engine, and if you want to use it in Rails, it integrates that into your Rails apps. So that's all it does right now. And it's quite simple. You add the gem, and you run the generator, which will give you an initializer. And in the initializer, you can say, I want to intercept all these ERB files to be processed by the Herb engine. And by doing these 2 steps, you get the tooling and all of that built in. And then you can just start debugging, and that's all you need. The other thing I've been trying out is to actually annotate the individual labels with the runtime, like how long it took to run this specific piece of the page. So you can kind of see where stuff is being slowed for rendering, which is kind of inspired from this log from the output that you have in your server log. And you can also try to then do more things here to kind of say, well, it took that much CPU, that many queries were made in the partial, so you can kind of see where stuff is actually slow. And these remaining levels are what we can now do with Herb that we released today with this kind of new release. We can start to work on this 3rd and 4th level, which are these optimizations. So we know when you use a render call and you do these other calls, like use these tag helpers, we can compile them ahead of time and make them much more efficient. So this should kind of help with slow partial lookups and other things that we can now start to tackle. And the kind of this is more like performance-wise, but more kind of practical are these reactive views. This kind of takes a lot of inspiration from Phoenix Live View, if you know it from Phoenix and Elixir, and from Stimulus Reflex. But what we want to do is kind of bring that to Rails too. And the fifth level would be to see if we can make client-side templates work. So when you say you have a limited set of ERB, that you can also just try to render this on the clients. Kind of like ERB client components that could compile to maybe web components or React components. I'm not sure about the exact details, but that's kind of the idea that we can explore at least. And the final thing is to just appreciate or enable other frameworks to be embedded in ERB too. So that you don't have to abandon ERB altogether, but you can say, I want to use this React component in my ERB views, and it just works. And you can do it only on certain pages. So kind of thinking like, you have this, with import map Rails, you have this kind of pin architecture. So what if you could say, I want to import these components from these packages, from React packages, or from my local folder somewhere in my Rails app. And then in my ERB view, I can just reference these as they are by name, and they just work next to your existing ERB. That's kind of the idea. I'm not sure if it's really feasible, but that's kind of where I want to go to see what we can now do with this. And since the engine already knows exactly what these tools are, what these elements are, it can tell you about these errors, but also can pass along the right props and make them instantiate on the client when they need to be instantiated. This is kind of similar to inertia Rails too, if you have seen that, but with the difference that this is all kind of integrated in one thing. So yeah, if you want to kind of look at the whole kind of vision for that, that's the talk from RailsConf last year, and that's if you want to learn more about that. But yeah, if you are building ambitious apps with ERB today, I would love to kind of hear your needs and what you are looking for, what you're missing from these tools. So if you have some of these ideas and want to kind of help shape how this looks like, then please get in touch. So yeah, to conclude, it's been really kind of interesting to see how the Ruby Prism parser has changed the Ruby tooling landscape in general. Prism enabled Ruby LSP. Prism is also enabling now Rubocop to be way more efficient, and a lot of other tools, including now Herb to exist. And I can kind of feel like that Herb can enable a different kind of success or strategy that we can have for rendering views and rendering HTML and templating and the tooling around that. Herb itself initially was just a parser, but it's now this whole ecosystem and this tool chain that you can use in your apps today. So this really unlocks a whole set of new tools to be built, and I believe that this is showing already where we can go from here. That we can push more boundaries and make more awesome things with that. The community itself has really built awesome tools for Rails, and that's what Rails and Ruby enable you to build. And I think it's now time to bring the same care to the view layer to make this just as nice to work in HTML ERB. And with Herb and ReActionView, I believe we have a path forward with that. I also believe that Herb Engine has a lot of potential, that we can kind of try to maybe bring this even in other frameworks by default, and just have it enabled. You don't have to configure anything anymore. And that's kind of why I'm still doing this today, because I love seeing how this stuff evolves. And I also love to see how this is already kind of changing how people use and interact with HTML ERB fast today. So I hope this talk has given you an overview of Herb and its potential. And if you have an application using HTML ERB, please give them a try and report any issues you might see. Finally, I want to thank all the people that have been contributing to Herb itself. There's a lot of awesome people that have been opening issues and fixing bugs. And I also want to thank all the people that have been supporting this work on GitHub sponsors, which are really kind of vital to make this all work. And finally, I was accepted for the GEM Fellowship from the GEM Co-op grant last year. So they are giving out money for open source and Ruby for people to work on. And they accepted Herb as one of the projects, so they are supporting this with a grant to enable Herb to be more efficient, but also enable exploring some of this reactivity in the future. So that's really awesome to see. Thank you. So yeah, If you can, give it a star on GitHub and check out the docs on herbtools.dev. That's all I have. Thank you.
I bet there are quite a few questions, but I want to nudge you to the hallway to ask them and tonight, because this will give Marco the opportunity to pull out his laptop and show you some code, and you can hack together. So again, you have 10 minutes. Not like last time, actually 10 minutes for break.